What if everything you sacrificed to protect your child led you right into danger you never saw coming? What if the school that promised safety, diversity, and hope for a better future hid something far more sinister behind its bright murals and smiling teachers? Would you trust the warm handshakes, the glowing reviews, and the polished classrooms? Or would you listen to the quiet unease in your child's eyes when she comes home different? For Malik and Jasmine Weston, BMFI Elementary seemed like a dream come true. But when their daughter Amara's joy turns into silence and her light dims overnight, they're forced to ask, how far would you go to uncover the truth and protect your child when no one else sees what's happening? Before we continue this story, let us know where you are watching from. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. Malik and Jasmine Weston still remember the day they first walked through the doors of BMFI Elementary. The school was immaculate, with wide corridors lit by natural sunlight and walls covered in vibrant student artwork. For the Westons, this place was the dream they had worked so hard to achieve. A diverse, forward-thinking institution where their 10-year-old daughter, Amara, could thrive without fear of being an outsider. Amara's old school had left her shaken by cruel bullying and racial taunts. So relocating to this new neighborhood and enrolling her at BMFI Elementary felt like a fresh start. On a cool autumn evening, parents filled the hallways for the annual conference, and Malik and Jasmine arrived feeling a mixture of nervousness and excitement. They passed displays of children's paintings, portraits, collages, and nature scenes, all testaments to the creativity that the school encouraged. As they entered Amara's current classroom, they were greeted by Mrs. Thompson, her teacher. The warm glow in Mrs. Thompson's eyes reassured them that they had made the right decision in bringing Amara here. Mr. and Mrs. Weston, Mrs. Thompson began, "It's wonderful to see you both. Amara is an exceptional student. She's bright, compassionate, and has an innate ability to lead her peers. I've seen her take charge of group activities, lending a helping hand to those who struggle." She opened a folder brimming with Amara's assignments, spotless math worksheets, detailed reading comprehension pages, and creative writing tasks that showcased Amara's thoughtfulness and depth. Malik and Jasmine listened with quiet pride. They had always known Amara was special, but hearing it from a respected teacher validated the sacrifices they'd made, selling their old home, relocating to a pricier neighborhood, and trusting that BMFI Elementary would be different from where Amara had faced so many hardships before. "We're so thankful to have found this community," Jasmine said as she flipped through the stack of papers with a gentle smile. "We worried a lot about fitting in and whether Amara would be welcomed, but you've all been so supportive." "I'm going to miss having her in my class," Mrs. Thompson admitted. "She's truly a joy to teach, but I know she's ready for new challenges in Mrs. Miller's class. You'll meet Mrs. Miller shortly. She's been excited to have Amara join." Just then, there was a light knock on the door, and a woman with a genial smile stepped inside. Susan Miller introduced herself politely, shook Malik's hand, and expressed her enthusiasm for teaching Amara. Her words flowed easily, projecting warmth and confidence. She spoke about the projects she planned for her new students, hands-on science experiments, in-depth reading sessions, and collaborative group tasks. Her demeanor radiated kindness, enough to quell any lingering anxiety Jasmine might have felt. When Mrs. Miller finally left the room, Malik and Jasmine shared a look of relief. Everything was falling into place. After all the hardships in their previous neighborhood, especially the intolerance and targeted bullying Amara had endured, BMFI Elementary felt like a sanctuary. The school's reputation, the diverse staff, and the supportive environment seemed tailored for success. That night, they returned home to find Amara reading in the living room. She was perched on the couch, legs folded under her, a large chapter book resting on her lap. Hearing the front door creak open, she bounded to her feet. "How was it?" she asked, eyes shining with excitement. Malik scooped her up and spun her around, as he had done since she was small. "Mrs. Thompson couldn't say enough good things about you. he teased, setting her gently on her feet. And we met your new teacher, too. Mrs. Miller can't wait to have you in her class. Amara's face lit up. She was the sort of child who thrived on possibilities, new books to read, new puzzles to solve, and new experiments to try. I heard Mrs. Miller does awesome science labs, she said, her voice echoing her curiosity. I can't wait. Later that evening, as Amara prepared for bed, Malik and Jasmine lingered in the hallway, talking in hushed tones. I think we've finally found the right place, Malik mused, recalling the bright classroom walls and Mrs. Miller's confident handshake. Amara's safe here, surrounded by teachers who believe in her. Jasmine nodded, reaching for his hand. After everything at the old school, it's a relief. I want her to love learning, without fear or stress. She deserves that. Neither of them could have guessed that the promise of security they felt was about to shatter, and that the teacher who seemed so welcoming would soon reveal a dark side that no one saw coming. In their hearts, they still believed that BMFI Elementary was the haven Amara needed. Yet the next few days would uproot that faith in ways they could never have anticipated. Early Monday morning arrived with the sky painted in pale streaks of pink and gold. Amara was already dressed in her crisp school uniform by the time her parents came to check on her. She was too excited to wait, bounding around her room, making sure her notebooks, pencils, and science project notes were tucked away in her backpack. This was her first official day in Mrs. Miller's class, and the anticipation had her practically glowing. At breakfast, Jasmine laid out a plate of pancakes, and Malik sipped his coffee as he watched his daughter chat about all the projects she hoped to tackle in her new classroom. I heard we're going to do something cool with magnets this week, Amara said, her eyes brimming with excitement, and maybe grow crystals for a chemistry lesson. Malik and Jasmine exchanged contented smiles. Every parent longs to see their child this engaged and curious. Jasmine gently reminded Amara to calm down enough to actually eat her pancakes, while Malik teased her about accidentally losing her voice before she could even ask Mrs. Miller a single question. When the school bus rumbled up to the curb, Amara gave them both quick hugs and darted out the door, waving from the bus window until it turned the corner. The rest of the morning passed peacefully for Malik and Jasmine. They both had work to do, but the sense of reassurance lingered. Amara was in a place where she would be nurtured and challenged. However, that feeling would not last. When a school day ended, Amara usually bounded off the bus, bursting with stories of her day, who she sat with at lunch, what funny thing someone said, or which group activity she led. But today, she trudged down the driveway. Her shoulders slumped. Seeing his daughter's posture, Malik felt a pang of worry. Jasmine stood by the front door, ready to greet her with a snack and a big smile. How was the first day with Mrs. Miller? Jasmine asked gently, noticing Amara was uncharacteristically quiet. It was all right, Amara mumbled, barely meeting her mother's eyes. She walked straight to her room and shut the door, leaving her parents in tense silence. It was a striking change from the bright, enthusiastic child they knew. Malik and Jasmine locked eyes, communicating the same unspoken concern. Something was definitely off. They decided to give Amara a little space before pressing her. Dinner that night was grilled chicken and vegetables, a meal that usually delighted Amara. Yet she ate with a single-minded intensity, taking 2 or 3 helpings, almost as if she hadn't eaten all day. Any attempts at conversation were met with monosyllabic answers. "Are you all right, Princess?" Malik asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Did you skip lunch or something? You seem pretty hungry." Amara paused, her fork mid-air, then shook her head and forced a small smile. The tension in her eyes was unmistakable to her parents, who knew her every nuance. After dinner, she vanished to her room again, leaving her parents at the table with half-eaten plates and a shared unease. Jasmine was the first to voice what both of them had been silently suspecting. "Do you think someone said something to her?" she asked in a hushed tone, memories of the old school creeping back. "She hasn't acted like this since." "I know," Malik said quietly, recalling the tears Amara used to fight back after being called names at her previous school. He set his napkin down and leaned forward. I'm going to see if she wants to talk. He found Amara on her bed, hugging her worn stuffed elephant, an item she hadn't clung to since she was 6. Her eyes flickered to her father, filled with an emotion he couldn't quite read. It was somewhere between sadness and apprehension. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Want to tell me about your day?" She hesitated, fiddling with the stuffed elephant's ear. "It's just new," she replied, her voice nearly a whisper. "Different class, different kids. Maybe I'm just tired." Malik gently reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're here for you, no matter what, okay? If you need to talk about anything." Amara nodded, but her gaze remained downcast. "I know, Dad. Really, I'm just tired. Maybe tomorrow will be better." Something in her tone was hollow, but Malik resisted the urge to push further. He leaned in to kiss her forehead and whispered goodnight. Once he was back in the hallway, he found Jasmine waiting, her eyes anxious. "She says she's just tired," he recounted, closing Amara's door softly. "But the way she's acting, I don't believe that's all. This reminds me too much of before." Jasmine inhaled shakily, recalling the day they discovered how vicious the bullying had been at the old school. "Let's keep a close eye on her," she suggested. "Maybe it'll blow over. Or maybe she just needs a few days to adjust." But deep down, she was every bit as worried as Malik. That night, Malik lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He replayed the events of the day in his mind. Amara's downcast eyes, her near-silent responses, and that voracious appetite at dinner. Could it really be a repeat of their past nightmare? With a surge of determination, he made up his mind. He wouldn't allow his daughter to suffer in silence ever again. If something was wrong, he needed to find answers. By Tuesday morning, Malik had already decided he would not simply wait for Amara to confide in him. He needed to see firsthand what was happening at BMFI Elementary. So he volunteered to drop her off at school, framing it as a sweet gesture of fatherly support. Amara accepted without much reaction, which only fueled his concern. As Malik pulled the car into the school's driveway, he noted the early sunlight on the playground and the rows of neat flower beds that parents had helped plant. Everything looked pristine, a perfect place for learning. But he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that behind the school's cheerful facade, something was amiss. Amara climbed out of the car, wearing a forced smile that made Malik's stomach twist. Once she disappeared into the building, Malik parked on a side street and circled back, finding a discreet spot by the cafeteria windows. He intended to stay there all day if necessary, watching how the staff and students interacted during recess and lunchtime. He reasoned that if Amara had been starving at dinner, something must be happening at lunch. Perhaps she wasn't being allowed to eat, or her food was taken away. Sitting in his car, he texted his office to say he would be out on personal business, feeling a twinge of guilt for not telling Jasmine about this plan. Yet he believed she might worry excessively, and he needed to focus on keeping his emotions in check. The morning dragged on. Through the windows, he occasionally glimpsed students switching classes. He spotted Mrs. Miller's figure once, blonde-gray hair, a formal blouse, and felt a spike of anger that he struggled to keep at bay. When the first recess came, Malik strained to see Amara among the children. She was there, near the edge of the playground, as though trying to keep a low profile. It pained him to see his usually outgoing daughter shy away. Still, nothing seemed blatantly wrong. Other kids approached her, and she even smiled briefly, but it was fleeting. No one seemed to be ridiculing or ostracizing her, and Mrs. Miller was nowhere in sight. Time crawled until the lunch bell rang for the first group. Malik knew Amara's class had the second lunch shift, so he prepared himself. When the second lunch shift arrived, he watched the line form. His daughter shuffled forward, tray in hand, while the cafeteria workers doled out the day's meal: pasta, side salad, maybe some fruit. But abruptly, Mrs. Miller emerged and whispered something to the staff. Immediately, they stepped aside, allowing her to serve Amara herself. Malik leaned forward in his seat, heart pounding. He saw Mrs. Miller place a single item in the center of Amara's tray, something that didn't resemble the other meals at all. When Amara turned away from the line and walked toward an isolated table, Malik caught a clearer glimpse of the object. It made his blood run cold. A small, fried frog, limbs splayed out in a grotesque display. The shock was so intense that Malik briefly froze. Then he noticed Amara sitting alone, staring at this awful thing on her tray. Other students had typical lunches, bowls of spaghetti or sandwiches, while his daughter was presented with this revolting creature. Her posture radiated shame and fear and Mrs. Miller had simply vanished back into the crowded cafeteria, leaving Amara isolated. Malik gripped the steering wheel, seething with anger and disbelief. Was this some kind of sick prank? A bizarre lesson plan? But the sense of malicious intent was unmistakable. He threw open his car door and strode into the school through an open side entrance. By the time he reached the cafeteria, he saw Amara trying not to cry, head bent low, the horrifying lunch still on her tray. "Amara," he called out, voice reverberating in the hushed space. She jerked her head up, eyes widening in both surprise and relief. Instantly, she jumped from her seat and ran into his arms. Her little body trembled against him. "What is this?" Malik demanded gently, though his rage simmered just beneath the surface. Amara's voice was barely audible as she choked out a reply. "Mrs. Miller said this is what people like us eat," she whispered. The words stung. All the illusions they had clung to about BMFI Elementary's inclusivity shattered in that moment. Every protective instinct roared to life within Malik. He patted Amara's back and felt the child's tears seep into his shirt. Spotting the tray on the table, he snapped a quick photo with his phone. His fingers shook, but he managed it. He wanted proof of this hateful act. A teacher who not only served something inedible to a young girl, but also cloaked it in racist undertones. The cafeteria fell unnervingly silent, a few students pulling out phones to record the scene. Malik dialed 911 right there, not bothering to step outside. He wanted everyone to know exactly how serious this was. "I need officers at BMFI Elementary," he said tersely when the operator picked up. "A hate crime is being committed against my daughter." Some teachers and staff began to gather, clearly alarmed. But Mrs. Miller was nowhere in sight. Malik guided Amara out of the cafeteria, holding her close, whispering words of reassurance. "I'm so sorry, Princess," he murmured, voice trembling. "You didn't deserve any of this. We're going to make this right." Amara looked up at him with tear-streaked cheeks. "I didn't know if it was my fault," she managed to say. "She told me I should be grateful." "Don't you dare think that," Malik cut in, voice wavering between heartbreak and fury. "We are not letting this go." Within minutes, the police arrived. 2 officers, one older and one younger, entered the building, escorted by a wide-eyed secretary. The principal, Mr. Roberts, had also been summoned. He stood near the main office, looking as though a bomb had just gone off in his typically orderly domain. Students peered from classrooms, eyes wide with confusion or alarm. A few had been filming on their phones, capturing moments that would soon ricochet through social media. Malik held Amara protectively at his side as he pointed the officers toward the cafeteria, where the shocking evidence still lay untouched on a tray. Her eyes were red from crying, and the stuffed elephant from her backpack was clutched tightly in her arms. Principal Roberts ushered the group into the cafeteria, face pale as he caught sight of the fried frog on the tray. "This is absolutely unacceptable," the principal began, voice shaky with anger or shock, perhaps both. "Mr. Weston, I cannot express how—" Malik shot him a glare, cutting him off. "Where is Mrs. Miller?" His words came out clipped and urgent. "I watched her personally place this on my daughter's tray. I want to know what she has to say for herself." One of the police officers, the older one, scribbled in a small notebook, his expression wavering between skepticism and alarm. "Let's talk to this Mrs. Miller," he said evenly, "and to any witnesses who saw what happened." The younger officer, who introduced himself as Officer Jordan, stooped down to Amara's level. He spoke with quiet concern, asking if she felt okay, if she needed anything. She managed to nod, her voice too shaky for more. Malik appreciated the sensitivity, but his own temper simmered close to boiling. He wanted answers. He wanted justice. Principal Roberts directed them to Mrs. Miller's classroom. They found her inside, sorting papers with an odd calmness, as though oblivious to the chaos she had caused. She barely looked up when the group entered. Malik could feel the tension in the room rise by several notches. Mrs. Miller, Principal Roberts began cautiously. Could you explain what happened in the cafeteria today? There are serious allegations. She let out a tiny sigh, finally glancing at Malik and the officers. This is a complete misunderstanding, she said in an icy voice. I was trying to show the children something new for science class, an amphibian specimen. Perhaps it was in poor taste to serve it at lunch, but I assure you, there was no harmful intent. Malik's jaw clenched. Don't you dare call this a misunderstanding. You humiliated my daughter in front of the entire cafeteria and told her it was what people like us eat. He took a shaking breath. How dare you stand there and pretend this was some educational exercise? Mrs. Miller's gaze flickered, a hint of arrogance in her posture. I have no idea what he's talking about, she told the police. Yes, I placed a frog on her tray as part of a demonstration for a future lesson, but the rest is absurd. It's one student's word against mine. Principal Roberts looked horrified. Susan, that's outrageous. Even if it was a science experiment, you don't serve it on a lunch tray to a child. The older officer appeared uncertain, lips pressed thin. But Officer Jordan stepped forward, clearing his throat. Ma'am, he said, addressing Mrs. Miller, we have a photograph of the tray and statements from several students who recorded the incident or saw what happened. We'll also be talking to cafeteria staff. If there's evidence of a racially charged statement, this is more than a misunderstanding. This could constitute a hate crime. Mrs. Miller's calm facade wavered. I never said anything about people like us. Her eyes darted around, noticing the wave of condemnation. Her thinly veiled smile vanished. She was cornered, and everyone in the room could see it. A flurry of administrative staff converged then, some of them confused, others outraged. The air buzzed with whispered discussions. The older police officer stepped back to speak into his radio. Principal Roberts rubbed his temples as if trying to ward off a headache. Amara stood quietly behind her father, face partially hidden by her stuffed elephant, trembling whenever misses. Miller's gaze drifted her way. You're not just in trouble with the school, Malik growled at Mrs. Miller, voice low. You're in trouble with the law. The gravity of his words seemed to tighten the tension in her shoulders. This was no longer a trivial dispute. It was a legal and ethical nightmare. Principal Roberts finally mustered some authority, turning to Mrs. Miller with a stern expression. I'm placing you on immediate administrative leave pending investigation, he declared. I want you out of this school until further notice. At that moment, the older police officer signaled to Officer Jordan. He approached Mrs. Miller, reciting her rights as he instructed her to turn around. She stared in disbelief, hands shaking. This is ridiculous, she protested. You have the right to remain silent, Officer Jordan repeated calmly, guiding her arms behind her back. For a split second, the entire room seemed to freeze. Then the metal click of handcuffs echoed off the classroom walls. Mrs. Miller's face turned ashen, devoid of the smugness she had worn minutes before. Malik felt a rush of mixed emotions, relief, anger, and a profound sadness that the place he trusted had allowed someone like her to teach children. He wrapped an arm around Amara's shoulders, leading her away before they had to watch Mrs. Miller be escorted out of the school. Principal Roberts followed, apologizing profusely, promising an immediate inquiry. But in Malik's mind, the damage was already done. He and Amara walked out to the car, where he wrapped his daughter in a warm blanket he kept in the trunk. Stay here for a moment, Princess, he said softly. I just need to have a final word with the officers and the principal. She nodded, eyes fixed on the school as if it were some looming fortress of confusion and hurt. Malik's protective instincts blazed brighter than ever. No matter how progressive or safe a school might appear, hate could fester anywhere. He vowed to never again doubt his gut when it came to his daughter's well-being. By late afternoon, BMFI Elementary's hallways were filled with murmurs of shock, teachers whispering, and curious students lingering near windows to see a teacher led away by the police. The entire day had upended the usual sense of order. Malik found himself in the principal's office again, this time with a shaken Amara seated next to him, while Principal Roberts wrung his hands anxiously behind his desk. "Mr. Weston," the principal began, voice tight with remorse, "I can't apologize enough for what happened to your daughter. I spoke to the cafeteria staff, and they confirmed Mrs. Miller explicitly demanded to serve that item to Amara herself. None of them understood her motive, but they followed her instructions because she was a teacher. They feel terrible about it now." Malik placed a comforting hand on Amara's shoulder. She hadn't spoken much since the police had escorted Mrs. Miller away. The child stared at the polished floor, processing the swirl of emotions: shock, confusion, betrayal. "We moved to this district because we believed in the school's values," Malik said quietly, controlling his anger with effort. "Now I have to ask myself, how could you hire someone capable of such hate?" Principal Roberts looked down, face etched with guilt. "We run background checks, require references. On paper, she was impeccable, solid credentials, recommendations from previous schools. None of this ever showed up. I'm at a loss." Jasmine arrived soon after, rushing in with worried eyes. She embraced Amara, stroking her daughter's braids. Malik stood to give his wife a quick hug, whispering in her ear about what had transpired. Jasmine's face turned pale, then furious. "I want to ensure Amara never has to see that woman again," she said, voice trembling. "And I want the school to make real changes." Principal Roberts nodded vigorously. "I've already reached out to the district superintendent. We'll be reviewing our policies, instituting mandatory sensitivity training, and ensuring an investigation clarifies how this could have happened at all. I promise you, Mrs. Miller will be barred from teaching here or anywhere in this district, pending the legal outcome." Amara clung to her mother, tears finally flowing freely. "It's over, sweetheart," Jasmine murmured, kissing her daughter's temple. "You never have to go through that again." But the wave of relief was punctuated by an undercurrent of lingering pain. Amara had witnessed hatred from someone who was supposed to protect and guide her. Malik and Jasmine knew that healing would take time. The old wounds from her previous school had barely healed, and now a fresh one had been cut open. When they arrived home, Jasmine ushered Amara into the living room and gave her a moment to rest. Malik prepared hot chocolate, hoping to offer some comfort. They settled around the dining table, the sweet aroma filling the air, but an uneasy silence draped over them. At last, Amara broke it with a soft, trembling question. "Daddy, why would she do that? Why would she say that this is what our kind eats?" Her eyes welled up again, searching for an explanation that made any sense at all. Malik swallowed hard. "Sometimes people hate what they don't understand," he said gently. "They have these awful ideas in their heads, and they act on them to hurt others, especially those they see as different. But it's not your fault. It has nothing to do with who you really are." Jasmine reached for her daughter's hand. "Mrs. Miller's actions say everything about her, not you. You're smart, kind, and wonderful. Never forget that." Amara nodded, though her gaze still flickered with lingering hurt. "I just felt like maybe I did something wrong." "Absolutely not," Malik said firmly. "You did everything right by telling us. Even if it was scary, you didn't keep it bottled up this time. And that helped us stop her." They spent the evening talking things through, answering Amara's questions and reassuring her that she was safe. Eventually, the conversation shifted to what would happen next. "We'll have to give statements," Malik explained, ruffling his daughter's hair gently. "And there might be media coverage, but we'll face it together. We won't let her get away with this." Jasmine emphasized that Amara could stay home from school for a few days if she needed. "We'll find you a teacher who respects you, who nurtures your gifts," she promised. "Nobody's going to force you to see Mrs. Miller again." As the evening wore on, Amara's eyelids grew heavy from the day's emotional toll. Malik carried her to bed and tucked her in with extra care. Standing at her doorway, He remembered how powerless he had felt when she was bullied at her old school. That time, it took months to unearth the truth. But here, he had intervened immediately. Back in the living room, Malik and Jasmine sat on the couch, exhausted. "I keep thinking how this place seemed perfect," Jasmine said, voice hushed. "And yet, hatred found its way into our daughter's life again." Malik nodded, exhaling. "We can't predict all the ugliness in the world, but we can fight it the moment it shows up. We showed Amara she doesn't have to face it alone." They clasped hands, a silent pact renewing between them. No matter how hidden or blatant prejudice might be, they would stand against it for their child's sake. Even though BMFI Elementary had left them shattered, they refused to let hatred define Amara's future. The next few days would be filled with interviews and official statements. The district would scramble to contain the scandal. But one thing was certain: Malik and Jasmine would stand guard, ensuring that Amara and any child in their community would never again be subjected to such cruelty without consequence. It was a promise forged in pain, but it was also a testament to their unbreakable bond as a family determined to confront injustice wherever it lurked. In the aftermath of Mrs. Miller's arrest, the Westons found themselves in a whirlwind of meetings, calls from concerned parents, and local news inquiries. Principal Roberts initiated a thorough review, determined to ensure that no vestiges of such hateful conduct remained hidden in the school. The cafeteria staff offered to give statements. Students' phone recordings surfaced as evidence. And other teachers expressed outrage that such a violation occurred under their collective watch. Though overwhelmed, Malik and Jasmine drew strength from one unshakable truth: they were not alone in demanding justice. Amara stayed home for several days, comforted by her parents' unwavering support and the knowledge that the entire community now understood the gravity of Mrs. Miller's actions. Friends and neighbors rallied around the Westons, delivering notes of encouragement and small tokens of kindness for Amara. Despite the gravity of what she had endured, she began to regain her sense of security, bolstered by the love enveloping her. It became clear that one terrible incident would not define Amara's future. It would, however, influence how she saw the world. She had learned, yet again, that racism could surface even in places that outwardly preached acceptance. But she had also seen how quickly people could unite to fight injustice. Guided by her parents' example, she understood that silence emboldens hate, whereas courage and truth can dismantle it. Ultimately, the Westons emerged from this ordeal with renewed resolve. They refused to let Mrs. Miller's malicious act overshadow all that BMFI Elementary still had to offer. Instead, they harnessed the momentum of outrage to push for tangible improvements. Their story served as a stark reminder: vigilance, action, and unity remain the most powerful defenses against intolerance, and no child should ever stand alone in facing it.